Most men assume that the moment a woman loses interest, she'll say something. She won't. By the time you notice the change, she's already decided. What men read as temporary distance is often permanent recalibration. The behavior that feels like waiting, the patience, the understanding, the space you're giving her, is being interpreted as something entirely different. And once that interpretation sets in, it doesn't reverse. This isn't about one conversation or one missed moment. It's about a pattern men mistake for consideration. You think you're showing maturity. She's reading disinterest. I'll explain how this gets misread in a moment. But first, understand what's already shifted before you even realize the conversation has changed. Men operate on a logic that assumes clarity. If something's wrong, it will be stated. If interest is fading, there will be a signal. But that's not how the internal decision process works. The decision happens in silence. The behavior that follows is just confirmation. This is where men double down. They believe effort will correct the trajectory. More attention, more reassurance, more presence. But the perception has already changed. Effort doesn't reset perception. It reinforces what she's already concluded. The timeline only looks sudden if you weren't watching earlier. What feels like a sharp shift is usually the final stage of something that's been building quietly for weeks. Men notice the outcome. They miss the recalibration. Here's what happens. A man gives space because he believes that's what's needed. He doesn't push. He doesn't pressure. He waits for her to come back to equilibrium. That waiting gets interpreted as absence. Not physical absence, psychological absence. The kind that suggests he's not invested enough to push through discomfort. And once that reading takes hold, the dynamic inverts. What he thought was patience becomes evidence of detachment. What he thought was respect becomes proof he doesn't care enough to fight for it. This is the part men don't expect. They assume that being emotionally controlled, not reactive, not desperate, will be valued. It is, in theory. But in practice, when a woman is evaluating whether someone is still emotionally present, restraint can look identical to indifference. The confusion comes from the fact that advice tells men to avoid being needy. Don't chase, don't over-pursue, give her space. And that advice is correct, under specific conditions. But those conditions aren't universal. When applied during a period of withdrawal, space doesn't create attraction. It accelerates distance. Men think, I'll wait until she's ready. Women think, if he wanted this, he'd be here. Both are operating on incompatible assumptions about what the other person needs. The mismatch isn't loud, it's quiet. It doesn't announce itself through arguments or confrontations. It surfaces through what doesn't happen. Conversations that trail off, plans that never materialize, affection that becomes mechanical rather than spontaneous. This is where the misinterpretation deepens. Men believe that by not reacting, they're demonstrating emotional stability. Women interpret that same non-reaction as a lack of urgency. If something mattered, it would be pursued. If it's not being pursued, it must not matter. The behavioral consequence is predictable. Responses slow down, tone flattens, warmth decreases. None of this is announced. It just happens incrementally until the gap becomes too obvious to ignore. By the time a man registers that something is off, the internal decision has usually been made. Not necessarily a decision to leave, but a decision to stop investing emotionally at the same level. And once that happens, the relationship doesn't reset. It recalibrates. What men often do at this stage is try to talk it through. They ask what's wrong. They offer reassurance. They attempt to restore what they assume is still intact. But the conversation isn't productive because the premise is already outdated. She's not evaluating whether he cares. She's already concluded he doesn't, at least not in the way that registers for her. This is the cognitive dissonance men experience. They know they care. They've been showing up, being present, giving space when needed. But that care isn't landing the way they think it is. And the more they try to explain it, the more it confirms the original perception, that he's responding to a problem, not to her. Men frequently say, I was doing everything right. And in terms of textbook advice, maybe they were. But doing what's recommended doesn't mean doing what's being perceived. Perception and intention are separate tracks. And when those tracks diverge, it's perception that dictates the outcome. The other variable men overlook is timing. There's a window during which corrective behavior works. Once that window closes, the same behavior produces the opposite result. What would have been read as attentiveness earlier now gets read as damage control. What would have been valued as consistency now looks like obligation. This is what makes the situation feel unfair. A man can be doing the same things he's always done, but because the context has shifted, those things no longer mean what they used to. The behavior didn't change, the interpretation did. And here's the part that's hardest to accept. Once the interpretation changes, explaining yourself doesn't fix it. Words don't override patterns. If the pattern she's reading tells her you're not invested, telling her you are doesn't correct that. It just creates more dissonance. What men experience as confusion, women experience as confirmation. He's confused because his actions don't match her response. She's confirmed because his confusion proves he wasn't paying attention in the first place. This is where men start searching for a turning point. When did this start? What did I miss? But there usually isn't a single moment. It's cumulative. Small things that didn't seem significant at the time become the evidence she uses to construct a larger narrative. And once that narrative is built, contradictory evidence doesn't dismantle it. It gets absorbed into it. If he suddenly increases effort, it's because he finally noticed, not because he cared all along. If he pulls back further, it's proof he never cared. The interpretation becomes self-reinforcing. Men often assume that if they just return to the baseline behavior that worked before, things will stabilize. But baseline only works when both people are still operating from the same reference point. If her reference point has shifted, returning to baseline doesn't restore equilibrium. It just highlights the gap. This is why the advice men receive often fails. Be patient. Give her space. Don't be needy. All of that works when the foundation is still intact. But if the foundation has already cracked, patience reads as apathy, space reads as abandonment, and restraint reads as proof you were never that interested to begin with. The practical reality is this: by the time a man realizes something is wrong, the recalibration is already underway. And recalibration doesn't reverse through effort. It reverses through a fundamental reset in how she's experiencing the dynamic, and that reset doesn't happen on demand. What men want is a clear diagnosis. Tell me what I did wrong, and I'll fix it. But the issue isn't always something that was done wrong. Sometimes it's something that wasn't done at all. And not doing something leaves no evidence to point to. It's absence, not action. And absence is harder to argue against. This is what makes the situation feel impossible. You can't defend against something you didn't know needed defending. You can't correct a perception you didn't know had formed. And by the time you're aware of it, the perception has already calcified. Men frequently describe this as feeling blindsided. One day everything seems fine, the next day it's not. But from her perspective, it wasn't sudden. It was gradual. She just stopped talking about it because talking about it didn't change anything. And here's the part that matters. Once she stops talking about it, she's no longer trying to fix it. She's managing it. And managing it means adjusting her expectations downward until the disappointment becomes tolerable. That adjustment is what men eventually notice. Not the disappointment itself, the adjustment. By then, it's not a crisis. It's the new normal. And the new normal doesn't demand a response. It's just what is. This is where men make their final miscalculation. They assume that because things have settled, the issue has resolved. It hasn't. It's just been absorbed. And what's been absorbed doesn't go away. It reconfigures how future interactions are interpreted. From that point forward, effort gets filtered through the lens of skepticism. Affection gets received with reservation. Reassurance gets processed as performance. Not because she's punishing you, because the internal map has been redrawn, and you're navigating a different landscape than the one you think you're in. Men keep operating as if the relationship is the same structure it was before. It's not. The architecture changed. The same hallways lead to different rooms now. The same gestures produce different reactions. What used to build closeness now maintains distance. What used to reassure now reminds her why she stopped expecting reassurance in the first place. The gestures that once carried weight now feel hollow. Not because they're insincere, but because they're arriving after the conclusion has already been drawn. You can't rewrite a narrative that's already been internalized. You can only confirm it or complicate it. And complication isn't correction. What men don't realize is that the woman they're trying to reconnect with isn't the same woman who pulled back. She's already moved through disappointment into acceptance. And acceptance doesn't look like anger or withdrawal. It looks like calm. It looks like normalcy. But it's not restoration. It's resignation dressed as peace. And once the architecture changes, the same actions produce different outcomes. This is what patience actually costs. Not time, perception. And perception, once shifted, doesn't shift back just because you want it to.